Ocean currents and climate. In this video, scientists will be able to comprehend how ocean currents affect regional climates. It's important to remember that oceans play a huge role in climate. And that's because oceans transfer heat from the sun around the globe. But how do they do that? Well, to figure out how oceans affect climate, scientists actually needed the help of rubber duckies. The story of the rubber duckies begins back in the 90s when a container ship, which was moving rubber duckies across the ocean, hit a storm, and thousands of rubber duckies fell into the ocean. Now that might seem like the end of the story, except for the fact that a few weeks later, people in California began finding rubber ducks washing up on the shore. The people picked up the rubber ducks, and they reported that they had found these rubber ducks. Interestingly, about a year later, folks in Japan started finding the same rubber duckies washing up on their beaches. And that seems like it might have been the end of the story, except for several years after that, the same rubber duckies ended up in Australia. And a couple of years after that, they were found in South America. And for a long time, it seemed like the story was over, except for the fact that 13 years after the storm knocked the rubber duckies into the ocean, the last rubber ducky was found in Scotland. So what did these duckies do? Well, they helped scientists figure out this map. This map shows you the currents in the oceans on Earth. You could see that some currents are warm currents and other currents are cold currents. You might notice that the warm currents are near the equator, which makes sense because the sun is most direct near the equator, and the cold currents tend to be towards the poles. And when you know the currents, all of a sudden the rubber ducky story starts to make a lot more sense. We can see how the rubber duckies, which started in the Pacific, would have been floating in the ocean and then moved towards California, where they were found on the beach. The rubber duckies continued floating across the Pacific Ocean, and they ended up in Japan. Now, if you follow the arrows that twist and turn across the Pacific Ocean, you could see how, through a very long route, the rubber duckies could have ended up in Australia, and they would have taken the East Australian Current, which you might recognize from Nemo. Once they were in Australia, they traveled along the currents over to South America, before they took a big loop underneath South America, up the coast of South America, along Africa, back over to South America, up North America, and finally arriving in Scotland 13 years after being tossed off a boat during a storm. So these ocean currents are moving across the oceans. And a current is simply a vast flow of water in the ocean. I like to think of currents as rivers that move through the ocean. And they move water from one part of Earth to another part of Earth. As we saw on the map, there are warm currents and cold currents. On most maps, warm currents will be represented with a red arrow, while cold currents will be represented with a blue arrow. And just like how we talked about how oceans warm and cool climates, warm currents tend to warm the air over land, whereas cold currents tend to cool the air over land. A really great example of this is in southern Africa. Along southern Africa, there is a cold current that goes up the left-hand side and a warm current that travels down the right-hand side. So what happens if we look at two locations with the same latitude? Since they have the same latitude, these two locations should have the exact same climate. However, the location on the left is near a cold current, whereas the location on the right is near a warm current. And if we look at their climates, you can see the effect of these currents. The location on the left has cooler summers and cooler winters. The cool current cooled down that climate. Whereas the location on the right has warmer summers and warmer winters. The warm water from that current helps warm that climate. So here's your key ideas. Currents are huge, moving flows of water in the ocean. And they tend to move heat away from the tropics towards the poles. That creates warm currents that warm regional climates, and cold currents that cool regional climates.